Tonight we step into the shadows of haunted places where sacred vows and restless spirits intertwine. Monasteries built for silence and prayer have become chambers of whispers, footsteps, and cries that never fade. Do you believe these ghosts are echoes of devotion long past, or something still lingering, watching, waiting? Share your thoughts as we descend into the whispers of the unknown. There is something about monasteries that draws both reverence and unease. Their stone walls stand for centuries, silent witnesses to countless prayers and secrets. Within those walls there is a stillness unlike anywhere else. It is not the calm of peace alone, but a stillness heavy with memory, as though the stones themselves breathe with the ghosts of the past. Outside, the world moves on, but inside a monastery, time feels suspended. Daylight filters through narrow windows, casting shapes that shift like living things. The air smells of incense, old wood, and damp stone. Every footstep echoes as though the walls are listening. It is here, in this silence, that whispers seem to gather. Some speak of voices carried on the wind, words of prayer uttered centuries ago. Others tell of unseen figures gliding through cloisters, their robes brushing the stone floor, their presence felt, but never seen clearly. These stories are not told by the living alone. They come from those who have walked the quiet halls and felt an inexplicable pull, as if the monastery itself is calling them to listen. History tells us monasteries were built to be sanctuaries. They were places where monks and nuns could escape the noise of the world, dedicating their lives to prayer, study, and service. The great abbeys and cloisters were constructed as shields against chaos, their walls offering protection and solitude. Yet in their pursuit of peace, many of these holy places became guardians of something else entirely, a lingering unrest born from human suffering, secrecy, and sometimes sin. Monks and nuns have lived in these walls for centuries. Their lives were ruled by discipline, silence, and ritual. Many found solace here, yet some found something darker. Within the cloister's stone embrace, emotions buried beneath vows could fester. Grief, guilt, fear, and defiance often found no escape except to linger. It was said that such emotions could bind a soul to a place. In monasteries, where silence is deep and prayers endless, these bound souls sometimes find no rest. There are monasteries whose histories are filled with accounts of strange occurrences. At times, the living have described hearing footsteps echo in empty corridors, the sound of chanting drifting through walls where no monks remain. Shadows are seen where light should reign. A door will close by itself, or a candle will flare without wind. Some speak of figures standing at the edges of vision, robes swaying in shapes that seem almost human but never fully form. Others hear whispers, not just prayers, but words of warning or lament. One such place is a centuries-old abbey in the hills of Europe. Its halls are a labyrinth of stone and silence. Locals say that at night, the monastery comes alive with sounds that have no source. A chant will rise in the darkness, steady and sorrowful, as if the monks themselves have never ceased their vigils. Visitors report feeling a presence just beyond reach, something that watches without moving. Those who linger too long speak of a weight pressing on their shoulders, a cold that cannot be explained. Some leave shaken, unable to speak of what they have felt. Others are drawn back, unable to resist returning to those silent walls. These stories speak to something deeper than superstition. They hint at a truth about monasteries, that silence is not simply an absence of sound, but a kind of memory. These walls remember the voices that once filled them. They remember the devotion and despair of those who lived and died within. In some way, the silence is alive, a resting place for echoes that never fade. Walking through such a place at night is to enter another world. The light is dim, shaped by flickering candles or moonlight spilling through narrow windows. Every step is softened, muffled by centuries of stone and dust. The air feels thick with something unseen. Occasionally there is movement in the corner of vision, a shadow too deliberate to be chance. And then there is the whisper, a voice so faint it could be mistaken for the wind, yet carrying a clarity that chills the heart. It speaks in languages long forgotten, in prayers that have been lost to time, and sometimes in words that belong only to the dead. These are the restless shadows that dwell in silent walls. They are not always malevolent. Some seem tied to devotion, endlessly replaying their prayers. Others are less benign, bound by regret or suffering that they cannot leave behind. They are part of the monastery's living history, woven to its stones, hidden within its silence. The first step inside such a monastery is to leave behind the world of certainty. Here there is no clear line between the living and the dead, the past and the present. In the hush of these sacred halls, every whisper, every shadow, becomes part of a story older than memory itself. And so begins the first murmur of these haunted sanctuaries. The deeper you walk into a monastery, the more the world outside begins to fade. The sound of wind in trees, the distant hum of life, even your own footsteps, they all grow softer. Inside there is another rhythm, a pulse tied not to time but to memory. In some cloisters, this pulse can be felt in the very stones beneath your feet. Those who have walked these halls speak of an energy that is almost alive, a quiet hum that seeps into the bones. It is in the quietest hours just before dawn when the veil feels thinnest. In that time, many claim they have felt the monastery breathe. Perhaps it is the sound of stone settling, or perhaps it is something far older, the breath of the unseen. There are monks who speak of this hour as the moment when prayer and spirit touch most closely. But there are others who call it the hour of the restless. Some monasteries have their own names for such disturbances. At one remote abbey, the phenomenon is called the singing silence. Those who hear it describe a sound not unlike a hymn carried on wind that has no direction. At another, deep in the mountains, it is called the hollow chant, a low murmur that rises and falls in waves, seeming to answer the prayers of centuries. Pilgrims who have stayed in these places speak of waking to that sound, unsure if they have dreamt it or truly heard it. History holds dark explanations. Some whisper that certain monasteries were built over ancient burial grounds, that the stones themselves were taken from places where death had been violent. Others speak of monasteries founded during times of plague, their cloisters becoming resting places not only for monks, but for the dying who had no other sanctuary. In such places, the veil between worlds is said to grow thin. The prayers of the living mingle with the sighs of the departed, and silence becomes a bridge between life and what lies beyond. There are countless accounts of those who have encountered the restless in cloisters. A pilgrim wandering alone might hear soft footsteps behind them, quickening to match their own pace, only to stop when they turn. Visitors report glimpses of shapes, pale figures in habit, drifting across a courtyard where no one should be. Some speak of faces in the shadows, glimpsed at the edge of perception, faces worn with sorrow and prayer. One story comes from an abbey built in the early Middle Ages, perched on a hill overlooking a valley of forgotten graves. In the dead of night, travelers passing nearby speak of seeing the cloisters illuminated without candle or torch. Inside, they say, the sound of chanting drifts outward steady and unbroken, as if a service was never interrupted. Those brave enough to enter speak of a deep silence within that swallows all sound as though the walls themselves are drawing breath. They tell of corridors that seem to shift, of stairways that lead to nowhere, and of a presence that watches without speaking. Perhaps what unsettles people most about monasteries is this merging of peace and unrest. They are designed to be places of stillness, yet within them linger echoes of movement. They are havens of faith, yet some are prisons for souls who cannot find release. To enter such a place is to step into a paradox, a house of prayer where silence carries the weight of voices that will never cease. The whispers in these halls are not always gentle. Some are sharp with warning, others thick with grief. In some cloisters, the silence itself becomes oppressive, pressing down on the soul. Pilgrims have told of sudden chills, of an almost tangible heaviness that follows them through corridors. They speak of a feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes tracing every step. Yet there is a strange draw to such places. Many who leave are drawn back, unable to resist the call of those silent walls. They speak of a longing that cannot be named, of a desire to return to a place where prayer still lingers in the stone, and shadows speak without words. These are the first whispers of monasteries, silent walls that remember, restless shadows that wander without end. They tell a story older than any living soul, a story of devotion, of silence, and of the quiet hauntings that dwell where faith and the unknown intertwine. Monasteries carry their own weight of history, a history written not in ink, but in stone. Every pillar, every worn step, every archway holds the echo of centuries. Within those walls, time does not pass in the way it does in the outside world. Moments stretch, and the past seems to fold into the present. For those who walk these cloisters at night, it is as if they are stepping not only through corridors of stone, but through corridors of memory itself. There are those who claim that monasteries remember more than the lives of monks and nuns. They say the walls remember the suffering and the sanctity, the faith and the fear, the moments of transcendence and moments of despair. In these places, prayer can become a kind of resonance, lingering long after voices have faded. It becomes part of the air, part of the stone, part of something larger that cannot be named. One of the most chilling tales comes from an abbey abandoned centuries ago, hidden deep in a forest. Travelers who pass near it speak of a strange quiet, so complete that it swallows all other sound. On moonless nights, some have reported hearing the faint echo of chanting, so soft it seems part of their own thoughts. They say that the sound draws them closer toward crumbling walls and empty halls. Those who have entered tell of corridors where the air feels thick, as if saturated with prayer. They speak of shadows moving where no one stands and of doors that open into nothing but darkness. There is a monastery in another part of the world, perched high on a cliff above a restless sea, where the living speak of more than whispers. They speak of a presence that watches from the cloisters, a presence that follows those who dare to linger after dark. The monks who once lived there believed that the sea carried voices of the departed calling to them. The living who visit say they hear them still, carried on the wind, distant hymns and solemn chants that fade as soon as they are recognized. These haunting moments are not always violent. Often they are soft, almost gentle, a quiet that speaks louder than sound. A single footstep in an empty corridor, the faint scent of incense when no candle burns, a whisper of prayer carried on the breeze. Such things are easy to dismiss until they are repeated, until they become a pattern that cannot be ignored. And then there is the certainty that some presence lingers not out of malice, but out of devotion, bound by something the living cannot release. Yet not all disturbances are gentle. In some monasteries, the unrest takes a darker form. There are those where anger and fear have left their mark, where apparitions appear not as peaceful guides, but as warnings. Some report seeing figures with faces twisted in silent screams, monks kneeling in prayer with hollow eyes, nuns drifting through the corridors with expressions of grief so deep they seem to carry centuries of sorrow. Others speak of sudden chills, of shadows that press close, of a sensation that something unseen is moving just behind them. It is in the stillness of night that these stories become most vivid. In the absence of distraction, the silence of the cloisters grows thick. The air itself feels heavier, as if it holds the weight of countless prayers and the sighs of those who have walked these halls before. And in that silence, the shadows take form. They are not always visible, but they are felt a shift in the air, a movement at the edge of vision, a presence that lingers just beyond understanding. Monasteries stand as monuments to faith, but they also stand as monuments to something far older, the idea that silence can hold memory and that memory can take form. For those who have passed through them, the experience is rarely forgotten. Some speak of a peace deeper than anything in the outside world, others of a fear that never fully fades. All speak of the sense that these places, for all their stillness, are alive, not with the noise of life, but with something older, something restless. The silent walls are not empty. They are filled with echoes of chants, of footsteps, of prayers that have endured long after the voices that spoke them have been silenced. And within those echoes dwell shadows. They are not always dark or threatening. Sometimes they are simply the memory of those who have walked the cloisters before. But sometimes they are more. They are the restless. These are the first stirrings in the heart of the haunted monastery, the opening of a story that will take us deeper into corridors where faith and fear meet, and where silence is never truly silent. There is a peculiar stillness in a monastery at the witching hour, a stillness that feels heavier than silence itself. It is a quiet, not born of peace, but of something watching, listening, and remembering. Within such halls, the air becomes dense, as if saturated with centuries of devotion and despair. Those who have spent the night in cloisters speak of it as a weight pressing softly against their skin, an unseen presence that watches without moving. Many monasteries guard secrets older than the stones of their walls. Some of these secrets are written in hidden records, locked away in archives long forgotten. Others are carried in the whispers that move through the corridors at night. There are cloisters where the chants of long-dead monks can still be heard, though no living voice speaks. There are chapels where the scent of incense lingers for no reason, and where a single candle will flare and die without cause. These are not accidents of the mind. They are traces left behind by devotion that never ended, by spirits bound to the places they once called home. In some monasteries, the restless are not just figures of shadow, but shapes of memory. There's a cloister in Italy where visitors speak of a monk who appears each night, clad in worn robes, carrying a candle that never burns down. He moves slowly, his steps silent, his face hidden beneath the shadow of his hood. Those who have seen him speak of an overwhelming sadness in his presence, as though he is trapped in a vigil that began centuries ago. No one knows why he lingers, but in that abbey, it is said that the monk's prayer still goes unanswered. There are other tales, darker still. In an ancient monastery in the mountains of Spain, it is said that a bell tolls at midnight, though no bell tower stands. The sound is deep and mournful, carrying across the empty cloisters. Monks who once lived there believed it was the bell of the dead, a summons for souls who could not rest. Travelers speak of hearing it, even from miles away, drawing them towards the monastery as though it were calling them home. Those who enter speak of corridors that twist impossibly, of stairways leading nowhere, of shadowy figures that vanish the moment they are seen. These restless shadows are not always visible. Sometimes they speak only in sensation, a sudden chill in the air, a pressure in the chest, the sensation of being watched. Pilgrims who have spent the night within such walls speak of dreams that feel like memories, of waking to hear a voice reciting a prayer they have never learned. Some wake to find the air heavy with the scent of candle wax and old wood. Others wake to the sound of their own name, whispered softly in a voice that is not their own. There are monasteries where the presence of the restless seems tied to devotion itself. A ruined abbey in France is said to be haunted by nuns who died during a siege centuries ago. They are said to rise in the hours before dawn, moving in silent procession through the cloisters. They carry nothing, speak nothing, but their footsteps echo through the stone in steady rhythm, as if still keeping vigil. Those who have seen them speak of a profound sadness in their movement, as though they are bound to a prayer that can never end. This is the paradox of haunted monasteries. They are places where silence becomes sound, and stillness becomes movement. They are sanctuaries built for peace, yet they hold the weight of unrest. Every stone holds a memory, every shadow a story. The faithful walk these halls seeking transcendence, and some leave touched by something far older, something that cannot be named. As night deepens, the monastery becomes a living thing. The walls breathe with memory, and the cloisters fill with whispers. Sometimes they are prayers, sometimes they are laments, and sometimes they are voices without meaning, echoes of lives that no longer exist. To walk these halls after dark is to step into another realm, a place where silence is not emptiness, but the echo of devotion, despair, and a restless presence that will not let go. And so the silent walls stand guarding their restless shadows. They are not just stone and mortar, but keepers of something eternal. Within them lies the beginning of every story told in the haunted cloisters of the world, a story that starts with stillness and ends only when the walls themselves fall silent forever. Monastic orders were meant to be sanctuaries of devotion, places where faith was lived in every breath. They were designed to separate the soul from the chaos of the world, to create a life of silence, prayer, and discipline. Yet some orders became known not for their sanctity, but for the darkness that took root within their walls. These were places where devotion became obsession, where faith became fear, and where the line between salvation and damnation blurred beyond recognition. There are records, fragments preserved in crumbling archives, of orders whose members lived under vows so strict they bent human endurance to breaking. Some monks and nuns devoted themselves entirely to silence, never speaking a word for years. Others bound themselves to their cells, never stepping beyond their stone walls. They sought perfection through deprivation. But in some cloisters, that deprivation gave birth to something darker. One monastery, deep in the highlands of Scotland, became infamous for its discipline. Its order required silence that lasted decades. Those who broke it were said to be bound in chains within the cloisters, left to pray in solitude until death. The punishment was not always physical. Some monks reported a torment far deeper, an overwhelming presence that would sit beside them in the darkness, whispering prayers they could not remember learning. They claimed that in the endless silence, voices came to them, voices that were not their own, chanting in tongues lost to time. The legends of such orders are not limited to whispers. In Italy, there was an order whose vows forbade not only speech, but the use of eyes. Monks lived cloistered in darkness, covering their faces with veils, their only light the faint glow of candles during prayer. They claimed this was the way to purify the soul, to free it from the distractions of the flesh. But those who entered the ruins of this monastery in later centuries spoke of something more. They said the air was thick with shadows, and that figures could be seen kneeling even when no living soul remained. Some who ventured inside never returned, and others came away with tales of faces pressed to the stone walls, whispering without sound. Orders such as these often become legends long after the living have gone. Their names fade from history, but the hauntings endure. Cloisters that once rang with prayer become silent except for the voices of the dead. In some monasteries, the chanting continues at midnight, though the bells no longer ring and the monks have been gone for centuries. Visitors who have spent nights in these places speak of waking to hear voices reciting the order's vows even when no one is near. They speak of figures in habit moving in the shadows, their faces hidden, their steps soundless, and of a stillness so complete it feels like eternity pressing down upon the living. There are orders where punishment itself became part of the haunting. An abbey in Eastern Europe was founded under an order devoted to penance through self-denial. The monks believed that suffering could cleanse the soul, and they built chambers where the guilty were left for years without food, water, or light. Over centuries, such chambers became places of legend. Travelers speak of descending into those ruins and finding the air filled with whispers, cries for mercy, the sound of chains dragging across stone, and the distant recitation of penitential prayers. Some say the spirits of those monks still walk the cloisters, bound to their vows and to the punishment they could not escape. In other cases, the darkness came not from discipline, but from fear. Orders faced with heresy or blasphemy would sometimes impose extreme penances on their members. A nun caught in the slightest breach of her vows could be sealed within a cell for the rest of her days. Some monasteries carried out these punishments in secret, hidden away in forgotten chambers. Over time, the stories of those who suffered turned into whispers of restless spirits. Visitors speak of hearing faint singing deep in the cloisters, a hymn of lament that ends in silence, as if swallowed by the stone itself. These monastic orders of the damned became their own kind of legend. They exist not just in history, but in the shadows, in the walls that remember every vow, every act of devotion, and every act of defiance. In the silent cloisters of these ancient sanctuaries, the vows themselves become a kind of haunting. The discipline that once defined life within those walls becomes the very thing that binds them to eternity. There is a monastery in Spain where such haunting is said to be strongest. It was once home to an order so strict that monks would spend years in complete isolation, hearing no sound but their own breaths. When the order was dissolved centuries ago, the monastery fell to ruin. Travelers now speak of entering its cloisters and hearing the faint sound of chanting, carrying across empty corridors. Some speak of glimpsing robed figures kneeling in prayer, their faces hidden in shadow. Others tell of waking to the sound of their own names whispered in voices not their own, as though the monastery itself remembered them. These orders of the damned are reminders that devotion can turn to obsession, and sanctity can give way to torment. Within their walls, silence is not peace, but a kind of imprisonment. Faith becomes a binding vow, and the dead become keepers of the same discipline they lived by. It is in these cloisters where faith and fear meet that the haunted orders linger. Their vows echo still, and those who walk their halls at night may find themselves hearing them to silent prayers, whispered confessions, and the sound of footsteps that will never end. The monastic orders that have endured through history are often remembered for their discipline, their faith, and their devotion. But some are remembered for something darker, the punishments they carried out in the name of purity, and the echoes those punishments left behind. These echoes are not just memories of cruelty, but a kind of haunting woven into the stone and silence of the cloisters. There are monasteries where penance became a ritual so severe that it shaped the life and death of those within. A remote abbey in the Carpathian Mountains was once home to an order that believed absolute silence was the purest prayer. The monks there took vows that forbade speech for decades. To break the vow was a sin punishable by isolation. Those who were punished in such a way were locked away in chambers deep beneath the abbey, left to pray in darkness until their final breath. Over centuries, those chambers became more than punishment cells. They became graves, and the voices of those trapped within are said to still echo through the stone corridors. Visitors to the ruins speak of hearing chanting beneath the ground, muffled and distant, as if the monks had never truly ceased their vigil. The orders of the damned often tied their punishments to the sanctity of their vows. In some cloisters, confession itself became an act of terror. A monastery in France was said to have a secret chamber where confessions of grave sin were spoken to no human ear. Instead, the words were whispered into stone walls where they would be carried away into silence. Over time, those who confessed in that chamber began to speak of hearing voices calling back to them, repeating their sins in a voice that was not their own. The stone seemed to remember, and in remembering, it gave back something unnatural. There is also a tradition of hidden penance punishments carried out not in the open, but in secret chambers below the cloisters, where no living soul would ever hear the cries. One monastery in Eastern Europe had a hidden crypt where nuns accused of breaking their vows were sent. There is no record of what happened within those walls, only whispers that survive in the local memory. Travelers speak of hearing a chant in the dead of night, a hymn of sorrow so haunting that it seems to come not from this world. Those who have dared to enter the ruins say they have felt a presence pressing close, a weight of devotion and despair that cannot be shaken. The discipline of these orders often gave rise to the most enduring hauntings. In cloisters where silence was absolute, the absence of sound became something unnatural. It was said that the walls began to speak in that silence, carrying the prayers and penances of the monks and nuns who had lived and died within. The chant of a single voice could become a chorus in the dark, and footsteps could be heard echoing in empty corridors. Those who have spent the night in such places speak of the sound of prayer as something that will not end, a voice that persists beyond death. One monastery in Italy became infamous for its vow of perpetual prayer. The order believed that prayer must never cease. At all hours, day and night, a monk or nun must be reciting prayer somewhere within the cloisters. When the monastery fell to ruin, the chants did not end. Visitors speak of hearing them carried on the wind, drifting through the crumbling arches and cloisters. They speak of feeling eyes upon them in the dark, of shadows that move without form, and of the certainty that the monastery itself remains in eternal vigil. These orders of the damned leave behind more than ruins. They leave behind a sense that the walls themselves have become part of the discipline, part of the vow. To walk their cloisters is to walk through centuries of devotion and punishment, to step into a living memory that is neither wholly sacred nor wholly profane. The silence becomes an inheritance, and those who enter inherit it. The haunting of monastic orders is not always violent. Sometimes it is a lingering devotion, a quiet that speaks louder than any sound. But in other cloisters, it is something darker, a presence born of vows broken or carried too far, a punishment given in silence, and of a faith that became a prison. In those places, devotion and damnation are one and the same. Within these walls, the orders of the damned endure. Their discipline has become their curse. Their vows have become their chains. And the cloisters themselves have become a sanctuary not only for prayer, but for restless souls bound to an eternity of silence and penance. The punishments carried out in these monastic orders were often designed not merely to correct, but to bind the soul. They were rituals of discipline that extended beyond the living, binding those who had passed away to the cloisters they once inhabited. This is why so many monasteries carry tales of apparitions that repeat their final acts of penance. It is as though the vows they took in life demand to be fulfilled still, long after their bodies have turned to dust. There is a monastery in the French countryside where the silence of its cloisters is said to hold more than prayer. Legend speaks of a vow taken by its order that no sound would ever disturb the stone after nightfall. To break it was considered the gravest of sins. Those who broke the vow were locked away without light or sustenance until they could offer no further confession. Some say that their voices remained trapped in the cloisters, murmuring prayers through the stone at midnight. Visitors claim to hear faint recitations, not of words they understand, but of a devotion so deep it becomes a lament. The discipline of these orders often created an atmosphere where reality itself seemed altered. Monks and nuns spoke of corridors that shifted underfoot, of doors that opened into places that should not exist. In some cloisters, the architecture itself became part of the penance, a labyrinth designed to disorient, to humble, and to bind the soul. Over centuries, such places developed reputations among pilgrims and travelers, not as holy sanctuaries, but as places to be approached with caution. For in entering them, one entered not only a monastery, but a living testament to vows that had become both salvation and curse. The records of these orders, where they survive, speak of a devotion so absolute it consumed everything. There are chronicles that speak of monks who would fast for years without breaking their vigil, nuns who would pray in silence so long they forgot the sound of their own voice. This is the heart of what made these orders feared and revered their ability to surrender the self completely. But in that surrender, something was lost. In their attempt to transcend the world, they often drew themselves into a state where the boundaries of life and death blurred. One of the most unsettling examples comes from an abbey in Eastern Europe, abandoned since the 15th century. Locals still speak of it with reverence and fear. They say that on certain nights, the cloisters seem to come alive with chanting. It is not a voice that can be traced to any single monk or nun. Rather, it is the sound of many voices woven together in eternal prayer. Those who enter speak of corridors that grow colder the further they go, of walls that seem to breathe, and of a presence that does not merely watch, but waits. Some say that those who hear the chanting are never truly free of it. The sound lingers in their minds long after they leave, pulling them back in dreams to the silent halls where vows were made and never broken. The most haunting stories of these orders are not always about punishment or discipline. Some speak of a devotion that became its own haunting, a vow so absolute that even in death it could not be released. There is a monastery in Italy where the order once vowed never to break their vigil. The monks took turns praying without end, hour by hour, day and night. When the order ended and the monastery fell to ruin, the vigil did not cease. Travelers who pass nearby swear they can hear the sound of prayer carried on the wind, faint but persistent. They speak of seeing figures kneel in the ruins at midnight, their faces hidden beneath hoods, their lips moving in prayer they have carried for centuries. These orders of the damned leave behind more than their history. They leave behind a living presence, a shadow of the vows they took. The discipline that shaped their lives becomes part of the haunting they leave behind. Cloisters that were once silent with devotion now echo with something more, with the weight of penitence, the pull of vows, and the restless presence of those who cannot let go. The orders themselves, in their extremes of discipline and silence, became monuments to something beyond life and death. Their cloisters became places where faith turned into obsession, and devotion became a kind of eternity. And within those walls, the restless linger still, bound by vows that cannot be broken, voices that cannot be silenced, and the ever-present shadow of the monastic orders of the damned. The haunting of monastic orders does not end when the stones crumble and the cloisters fall silent. In many ways, it begins anew with every visitor who steps within their ruins. These places are not simply abandoned. They are remembered, not only by history, but by something older, an echo of vows, a weight of discipline, a presence that lingers long after life has left the halls. In some monasteries, the haunting is tied to the very purpose of the order. An abbey in the mountains of Portugal was founded on the vow of silence and solitude. The monks there lived isolated from the world, rarely speaking even in prayer. They believed that silence brought them closer to the divine. But those who have wandered into the ruins speak of something far from peace. They speak of a silence so absolute it becomes sound, a low vibration felt in the bones, as if the walls themselves were murmuring. Some who enter describe hearing faint footsteps behind them, though the corridors remain empty. Others speak of a presence that follows them without movement, unseen but undeniable. There are orders whose vows extended beyond the living. They believe that devotion should not end in death, and they bound themselves to their monasteries with rites of permanence. At one such place in northern Spain, it is said that the monks would carve their vows into stone, a kind of spiritual binding that could not be undone. When the abbey was abandoned centuries later, the stones remained. Pilgrims say that at night those carvings seem to glow faintly, and that a chorus of whispering prayer rises from the ruins. They speak of robed figures kneeling in silence, and of corridors where sound itself feels drawn into shadow. The discipline of such orders was both a form of worship and a kind of imprisonment. Vows were not merely promises, but chains, binding those who took them to a path that could not be abandoned. For some, that path extended beyond life. Their devotion became an eternal vigil, and the cloisters their prison. In these places, faith and damnation became inseparable. There are cloisters where the vows themselves seem to have become a curse. In an abbey in Ireland, an order vowed to pray without cease for the forgiveness of sins, not just for themselves, but for the souls of the world. They built their monastery so that someone was always in prayer day and night. When the order ceased to exist, the monastery was abandoned, but the prayer did not end. Travelers speak of hearing faint recitations carried on the wind. Some say they have seen figures kneel in the ruins, their voices moving in silent devotion. Others have felt the brush of a shadow against their skin, as though the monk's vigil still reaches out to them. The stories of monastic orders of the damned are not always tales of horror. Some speak of a solemn beauty in their discipline, of vows kept beyond life, of prayers that linger like the scent of incense in stone corridors. But there is always a shadow in that beauty, a sense that something has been taken beyond return. It is a shadow born of vows broken and vows kept too far, of discipline turned to obsession, and of devotion transformed into a haunting. Perhaps that is why these cloisters remain places of fascination and fear. They stand not only as monuments to faith, but as warnings of its power to consume. They remind us that silence can become a voice, that discipline can become bondage, and that devotion can outlast the living. In the haunted cloisters of these orders, the dead do not rest. They remain bound to their vows, their chants lingering in the stone, their shadows moving in the silence. The monastic orders of the damned endure not in flesh, but in memory. They endure in the stone walls that have become their witnesses, in the chants that still drift through empty corridors, and in the restless presence that waits for those who enter. These cloisters are not merely relics of history. They are living testimonies to faith taken to its limits, and to the truth that some vows can bind beyond death itself. And so the orders remain silent, vigilant, and damn their cloisters echoing with devotion, discipline, and shadows that will never fade. There are cloisters where silence is not the only thing that lingers. Some monasteries carry a deeper, darker memory, a memory written not only in stone and shadow, but in blood. These are the cloisters where faith became a battlefield, where the walls themselves bear witness to acts of violence and sacrifice. The name blood in the cloister is not merely metaphor. In some of these places, it is a literal truth, carried forward in whispers that have survived centuries. Blood has always been a powerful symbol in monastic history. It has been shed in penitence, in ritual, and in conflict. The order there believed that their own suffering could protect the living. They took vows of sacrifice so extreme that they fasted for months, walked barefoot through snow, and beat themselves until they bled. Chroniclers of the time wrote that the cloisters would be slick with blood in the early hours of the night, the scent of iron lingering like incense. When the monastery fell to ruin, the stories did not fade. Pilgrims speak of walking those halls and feeling a sudden chill, as if the memory of blood still rests in the stone. Some claim they have seen stains reappear on the walls, dark and glistening, though there is no source for them. Others hear faint echoes of cries, soft at first, then growing louder, as if the cloisters themselves remember the hours when devotion was paid in pain. The history of blood in monasteries is not always the result of voluntary sacrifice. There are cloisters where blood was spilled in violence, not as ritual, but as punishment, as vengeance, as war. The histories of some orders are marked by betrayal and execution, carried out within stone walls meant for prayer. One monastery in Eastern Europe became infamous after a night of massacre in which an entire order was slaughtered, accused of heresy. Witnesses from the surrounding village spoke of seeing figures in habit, kneeling in prayer with blood on their robes, long after the killers had fled. The abbey was abandoned soon after, but the stories of blood that would not wash away remained. Travelers who visit speak of hearing muffled footsteps in corridors where no one walks, of cold drafts carrying the scent of iron, and of glimpses of figures standing silently in shadow, their faces turned downward as if in perpetual confession. In other cloisters, the stain of blood is tied to secrecy. Orders guarding relics and forbidden knowledge sometimes demanded extreme acts to protect them. There are ruins in Spain said to have been the site of such a vow sealed in blood. Those who entered speak of the air thick with a metallic scent, of walls that seem to darken as if absorbing the memory of violence. At night, they say they have heard chanting that turns into a sound like wet footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through empty halls. Some have felt a hand touch them in the darkness, cold and heavy, though no one was there. These stories are not easily dismissed. Across centuries and continents, pilgrims and travelers have passed down accounts of cloisters where blood became part of the memory, a kind of haunting all its own. Blood in the cloister is not merely the remnant of violence, it is a legacy. It is a testament to devotion carried to extremes, to vengeance born of faith, to secrets protected at any cost. It is a shadow that refuses to fade. In certain monasteries, blood is said to speak, Not in words, but in presence, in the change of air, in the chill that settles in the dark, in the way silence itself feels heavier. Those who have dared to spend a night in such cloisters speak of dreams they cannot explain. They dream of corridors slick with blood, of figures in habit, kneeling before altars unseen, and of voices reciting prayers in languages forgotten. They wake to find their clothes damp with cold sweat, to smell iron on their skin, and to feel as though they have stepped out of sleep and into something eternal. Blood in the cloister is not always tied to the past. In some places it is said to be ongoing, a cycle that repeats itself. There are monasteries where pilgrims have reported waking to find faint crimson stains on stone floors, stains that vanish by morning. Others have spoken of waking at midnight to the sound of chanting, of footsteps, and of a single drop of something warm falling on their hand, though no one is near. These accounts suggest that the memory of blood is not a thing buried by time, but something alive within the walls. There are monasteries where blood became more than a symbol of sacrifice or a mark of violence. In some cloisters, it became a part of the very ritual of life, a binding force that intertwined faith and fear. The stories speak not only of past acts, but of a presence that carries those acts into the present, binding the living to a memory written in stone and stained in crimson. One such cloister stands in the remote hills of England. It was once home to an order known as the Red Veil, named for their vows of blood sacrifice. Their purpose was said to be protection, guarding something so sacred it could not be named. They took vows to shed their own blood as an offering, to seal their prayers with their pain. Chroniclers speak of long nights filled with the sound of chanting and the strike of whips, of cloisters stained red with devotion. When the order vanished in the upheavals of war, their monastery fell into ruin. But travelers who approach it speak of seeing faint stains reappear on the stones after rain, dark streaks that vanish without explanation. Some have reported hearing chanting carried on the wind, a sound that rises and fades like the beating of a heart. In certain cloisters, the haunting of blood is tied to betrayal. A monastery in Eastern Europe was the site of a night so dark that it became legend. Members of the order were accused of heresy, and in a single night, they were bound and executed within their own cloisters. The blood they shed was never washed away, and it is said that the walls still hold it. Those who have entered the ruin speak of hearing cries and the sound of running footsteps in empty corridors. Some have seen figures kneeling in prayer, their robes darkened as though soaked, though no living soul is there to cast a shadow. The abbey stands abandoned now, but the story of that night endures, told in whispers to those who dare draw near. The blood spilled within cloisters is not always the product of punishment or sacrifice. There are monasteries where it is tied to protection vows sealed in crimson to guard relics and knowledge so sacred it could destroy those who touched them. In Spain, a ruined abbey is said to have once housed an order devoted to protecting a relic of unspeakable power. The monks took an oath to guard it until the end of days, and their oath was sealed in blood. Visitors to the site speak of a metallic scent that clings to the air, of shadows that move of their own accord, and of hearing soft chanting in the deep hours of night. Some have felt a cold hand brush against them in the darkness, while others have awakened with a faint warmth on their palms, as though a drop of blood had touched them. These accounts speak to something deeper than ritual or vengeance. They speak of a force that binds the living and the dead, of vows that extend beyond the grave. Blood in the cloister becomes more than a memory. It becomes a living presence, a shadow that endures. Those who enter such places often speak of an unshakable sense that they are being watched, of corridors that grow colder the deeper they go, of stone floors that seem to remember every step taken upon them. In certain monasteries, blood has become part of the air itself. Pilgrims speak of the scent of iron lingering long after the source is gone, of corridors that seem to pulse with something unseen. There are those who claim they have seen the walls breathe, as if drawing life from the sacrifice that once stained them. Some speak of waking to find faint crimson stains on their clothing or skin, with no explanation other than the thought that the cloisters themselves have marked them. Blood in the cloister is not merely the residue of history. It is a force that continues to shape these places. It is the memory of vows kept and broken, of sacrifice offered and refused, of violence carried out in the name of faith. It is a presence that clings to stone, a whisper that haunts silence, and a shadow that refuses to fade. The memory of blood lingers not because it is seen, but because it is felt. It lives in the air, in the silence, and in the heavy tread of footsteps that echo without origin. To step into such a cloister is to step into a living testament to devotion and destruction, to enter a place where faith and violence have been bound together in eternity. There are cloisters where blood is not just a memory, but a cycle that repeats itself, bound the walls and the vows once taken within them. Pilgrims speak of entering these places and sensing a change in the air, as though the stones themselves remember and call forth what was lost. In certain monasteries, the sound of chanting will rise without cause, and the scent of iron will follow those who walk the halls, even when the wind carries no hint of rain or rust. One such place is an abbey in the Black Forest, a ruin whose history is steeped in ritual sacrifice. The order that once lived there believed that their blood could purify not only themselves, but the world beyond their cloisters. They would gather at midnight in the chapel, striking themselves in penance and offering their lifeblood to sanctify the monastery. Chroniclers who survived the fall of the order wrote of corridors running red in the hours before dawn, of walls that seemed to weep, and of a silence that followed, heavier than death. Travelers now speak of hearing slow, deliberate footsteps in those halls at midnight, and of faint murmurs of prayer that rise without origin. Some have awakened to the taste of iron in their mouths, though they cannot explain why. The memory of blood in such cloisters is not something easily forgotten. It lingers in the stones carried on the air and woven into the shadows. In some monasteries, this memory becomes a warning. An ancient abbey in Ireland, long abandoned, is said to be cursed, the site of a massacre carried out in the name of heresy. On certain nights, visitors swear they can hear the cries of the slain, carried on the wind in the form of indistinct whispers. Others have reported seeing figures in dark robes kneeling in prayer, their garments stained in shadow, their faces hidden from sight. No matter how long the monastery stands empty, the memory of blood continues to awaken itself. There are also cloisters where blood is not tied to sacrifice or punishment, but to protection. In these places, violence was offered as a shield, a vow sealed in flesh and crimson. An abbey in Spain is said to have housed a relic so powerful it could not be guarded by words alone. The monks took an oath to defend it with their lives, offering blood as a covenant. After their order was scattered, the monastery fell into ruin, but the stories of blood endured. Pilgrims who pass its remains speak of a scent of iron in the air and of faint chanting that rises and falls in rhythm with their heartbeat. Some have felt something unseen brush against them, as if the cloisters themselves were testing their resolve. The persistence of such haunting suggests that blood in the cloister is not merely the mark of the past. It is a living force, bound to place and vow. Those who enter such places often speak of feeling drawn deeper into the cloisters, as though something within is calling them to witness the memory again. Some awaken from sleep in those ruins to the sound of chanting, to the sensation of cold stone beneath their palms, and to the certainty that they are not alone. In the most haunted cloisters, the presence of blood becomes part of the very air. It is the weight in silence, the chill in the dark, and the whisper at the edge of hearing. It is an echo of sacrifice, a remnant of violence, and a shadow that refuses to be laid to rest. Those who step into these cloisters are stepping into a living memory where faith, devotion, and blood have been bound together for eternity. The story of blood in the cloister is not one that ends. It continues in whispers and in silence, in shadows and in the scent of iron carried on the air. In these places, the past is not past, it is present, living within the stone and in the steps of those who dare to enter. Blood in the cloister is not merely a tale of history, it is a story that is still being written. The memory of blood in cloisters does not fade with the years. In some monasteries, it transforms into something beyond history, a living echo that lingers in the stones, in the air, and in the silence. Those who enter such places often speak of an unseen weight pressing down upon them, a sense that the walls themselves are alive with remembrance. There is a ruined abbey in northern France that has carried such a memory for centuries. The order that once lived there took vows sealed in sacrifice. Their cloisters were stained not by the passage of time, but by rituals of blood offered in solemn devotion. Chroniclers describe midnight processions through the stone halls, the air heavy with the scent of iron and incense. When the order was disbanded, the abbey fell to ruin, but the whispers did not cease. Visitors have spoken of hearing distant footsteps and chanting at night, and of waking to find their clothing damp with a substance that smelled of rust. Some have reported shadows that move independently of light, figures kneeling in prayer, their faces forever hidden beneath crimson veils. There are cloisters where blood is bound to the very foundation of the place. In Spain, a monastery known as the Sacrarium still draws pilgrims, though the order that lived there vanished centuries ago. The monks swore to protect a relic of unknown power, sealing their vow in a ritual of blood. It is said that the cloisters themselves drink in the sacrifice, keeping a memory that cannot be erased. Pilgrims speak of entering the ruins and feeling the air thicken, of hearing soft chanting, and of seeing stains reappear on stone that should have long since faded. Some say that the blood offers a warning, a reminder that certain vows are not easily broken, and that some acts of devotion demand a price beyond the living. Blood in the cloister is not always tied to faith. In certain places, it is bound to violence and betrayal. An abbey in Eastern Europe became the scene of an unspeakable massacre, carried out in the name of orthodoxy. Entire orders were destroyed within their own walls, their blood running through the cloisters for hours. Locals still speak of the night as one that left a wound upon the earth itself. Travelers tell of entering the ruins and hearing the sound of footsteps and muffled cries, of glimpsing figures clothed in shadow, and of feeling a chill that seems to come from beneath the stone. The story persists as a warning, a reminder that violence committed in the name of faith can stain far beyond the moment it is carried out. There are those who believe that the presence of blood in cloisters is not a haunting, but a vigil. It is a continuation of the vow taken within those walls, a devotion that cannot be ended even by death. In some monasteries, the blood is said to speak in silence, in the scent that lingers, in the chill that falls at midnight, and in the weight of stillness that rests on stone floors. Those who have entered such cloisters speak of feeling drawn deeper into them, of hearing soft recitations of prayer that cannot be traced to a voice, and of a certainty that they are not alone. Blood in the cloister becomes part of the architecture of memory. It is not something left behind. It is something that remains alive in the very stones, binding the past to the present. Some ruins carry this memory so strongly that it is impossible to pass through them without feeling its presence. The air grows colder, shadows lengthen, and silence becomes a living thing, heavy and full of expectation. In the most haunted cloisters, blood is a language not spoken, but felt. It speaks of sacrifice and penance, of violence and protection, of vows kept and vows broken. It is a voice older than memory, calling through centuries, carried on the air and in the footsteps of those who wander there. To enter such a cloister is to step into a place where faith and blood have become inseparable. It is to walk through a living testament to the devotion of those who once knelt there, and to stand within the shadow of something eternal. Blood in the cloister does not belong to the past. It belongs to the walls, to the silence, and to those who still hear its whisper. And so the cloisters keep their vigil, their stones stained and their air heavy, guarding the memory of sacrifice and the restless echo of vows that cannot be broken. Some places are haunted not merely by the shadows of the past, but by the objects they once held dear. Cloisters, abbeys, and monasteries have long been keepers of relics, artifacts of devotion, vessels of faith, and sometimes vessels of something far darker. These relics, whether fragments of holy scripture, bones of saints, or objects of ancient power, carry with them the weight of centuries. In certain cloisters, they are said to carry a curse. A relic is not merely an object. It is a memory made tangible, a piece of history bound in stone, metal, or bone. But in some places, relics become more than memory. They become a living thing. They hold the devotion of those who guarded them and the weight of every vow sworn before them. They carry with them a presence that outlives the cloisters themselves, a presence that whispers in the silence and moves in shadow. There is a monastery in Portugal whose greatest treasure was said to be a chalice carved from a single piece of obsidian. The monks believed it to be a vessel of divine power, capable of healing and blessing those who drank from it. But over centuries, the chalice became something feared rather than revered. Accounts tell of those who touched it and were struck with visions of blood and shadow, of hearing chanting in languages they did not know. When the monastery was abandoned, the chalice was taken, but those who held it spoke of dreams they could not escape, of voices calling them back to the cloisters, and of a sickness that clung to their skin. It vanished from history, but whispers of its presence survive, carried by travelers and pilgrims who speak of feeling watched when they stand on the grounds of the ruined monastery. The history of cursed relics is found in cloisters across the world. In some cases, the curse is a result of the object's purpose. A bone fragment, a sacred text, a piece of a saint's robe, each carries a power that demands reverence. But when devotion turns to obsession, that power can become a burden. An abbey in France was said to have guarded a cross of ivory carved by an unknown hand. The monks swore it could heal the sick and reveal truth to the faithful. Yet over time, it was said to bring madness to those who lingered too long in its presence. Chroniclers wrote of monks driven to desperation, speaking in tongues they did not know, or disappearing without a trace. When the abbey fell, the cross vanished, but the site remained a place where travelers speak of hearing whispers of prayer that turned to cries of despair. In some monasteries, the curse is tied to the ground itself. Sacred spaces are not merely built on stone. They are anchored to a place in history and memory. When those who guarded them fall, the ground can hold the memory of that loss. An abbey in Scotland stands on what was once believed to be the burial ground of a saint. The monks who lived there swore to protect the sanctity of that soil. They built cloisters and chapels over it, offering centuries of prayer. Yet when the order vanished, the ground was said to awaken. Visitors speak of hearing footsteps in the soil, of shadows moving beneath their feet, and of an unseen presence that rises with the night. Cursed relics and sacred grounds are bound by a singular truth. They are places where devotion meets danger. The power that draws the faithful to them can also draw them into darkness. To stand in a cloister that holds such a relic is to stand in a place where the veil between devotion and doom is thin. It is to be in a place where the memory of faith becomes a living presence, and where the silence carries something more than prayer. Some relics become the heart of their cloister's hauntings. A chalice, a fragment of bone, a worn manuscript, each can anchor a presence so deep it outlives the walls around it. Pilgrims who have entered cloisters where such relics were kept speak of an unshakable feeling that the object still remains even when it has been removed. They speak of cold air, of whispers in empty corridors, and of dreams that call them back to the cloister. In certain places, the curse is said to be deliberate, a safeguard placed by those who knew the power of the relic. A monastery in Italy is said to have bound a relic with a vow of silence, sealing it so that only the devoted might touch it. When the vow was broken, they say the relic took its vengeance. Visitors to the ruins speak of hearing chanting that swells and falls without cause, of shadows that linger too long, and of a pressure in the air that feels like a living thing. Cursed relics and sacred grounds do not simply vanish. They endure, carried in stories and carried in presence. To stand within such a cloister is to step into the memory of every prayer, every vow, every sacrifice that was made there. It is to be surrounded by devotion and danger, faith and fear, and to know that, in such places, the past is never truly gone. There are cloisters where the relic itself becomes more than an object of reverence. It becomes a living sentinel, a presence that outlasts those who once guarded it. In such places, the air carries something ancient, something that hums quietly in the silence. Pilgrims who enter these ruins often speak of a sense that the relic still watches them, that its power remains anchored not to stone or metal, but to the very ground itself. In a monastery in the Carpathian Mountains, a relic was kept that was said to contain the breath of a saint. Wrapped in cloth and placed in a shrine beneath the altar, it was venerated for centuries. The monks believed it brought protection to their order, but over time, the relic developed a reputation for exacting a price. Chroniclers spoke of those who lingered too long in its presence, falling ill, hearing voices, or vanishing without explanation. When the order fell, the relic disappeared, but the monastery became known as a place of unease. Visitors speak of footsteps echoing through the cloisters at night, of cold draughts that carry the faint scent of incense and iron, and of a voice calling softly in a language no living person knows. The curse of relics is often tied to their history. An object that has been bound by centuries of devotion carries with it every prayer, every vow, every act of sacrifice made in its name. When that devotion is broken, the object becomes a vessel of unrest. There is a cloister in Spain where a fragment of a saint's bone was kept beneath a marble altar. For centuries, pilgrims came to touch it, to pray beside it, believing it would grant protection. When the monastery was abandoned, the fragment vanished, but the place itself remained haunted. Visitors speak of faint whispers, of a warmth in the air that turns to chill, and of footsteps in corridors where no one walks. Sacred grounds hold their own power. They are not merely the resting place of relics, but of something deeper, a connection to a place set apart from the world. In Ireland, there is a ruin that was once both monastery and burial ground. The monks who lived there believed the earth beneath them was holy, consecrated by centuries of prayer. They built their cloisters over it, offering centuries of devotion. But when the order disappeared, the sanctity of the soil became a curse. Pilgrims speak of stepping onto the grounds and feeling their footsteps slow, as if the earth itself resists their presence. At night they hear whispers rising from the ground, and some speak of visions of cloisters alive with chanting that fades into the sound of weeping. Cursed relics and sacred grounds are bound together by a tension between reverence and danger. They are places where faith becomes something physical, something that can be touched, seen, and felt. But they are also places where that faith can turn to obsession, where devotion can become a prison. In cloisters where relics were kept, every stone carries the weight of centuries. Every shadow holds the memory of vows kept and broken, and every step is a step deeper into a living history. There are monasteries where the relic's power endures not only in the stone and air, but in the minds of those who approach it. Travelers to a ruined abbey in France speak of an unshakable feeling of being drawn toward the altar, though it is in ruins. They tell of hearing a voice, soft and persistent, whispering prayers in the dead of night. Others speak of seeing an object in the darkness, a chalice or bone fragment, though no such relic remains. The experience is not one of sight alone, but of presence, as if the relic still exists in some other form, anchored to the cloister in silence. The curse of sacred grounds is not always violent or terrifying. In some places, it is a quiet persistence, a pull that draws pilgrims to stand in the shadow of what was, to feel the weight of centuries of devotion. The monks and nuns who built these cloisters believed they were protecting something holy. Whether they succeeded or failed, the ground they consecrated continues to speak. It speaks in whispers, in footsteps, in shadows, and in the silence that falls when no one remains to guard it. To stand within such a cloister is to stand in the presence of something older than stone. It is to stand in a place where faith and memory have been bound together, where relics become relics of the soul, and where the ground itself keeps watch. In some cloisters, the power of cursed relics is so strong that it seems to warp the very space around them. Pilgrims who have entered such places speak of corridors that shift, of stone that feels warmer or colder depending on where one stands, and of an unshakable sensation that something unseen watches their every step. In monasteries where relics were kept, this is more than superstition. It is the memory of centuries of devotion, sacrifice, and protection that binds itself to the air and stone. There is a ruined abbey in Greece where a fragment of a relic was said to have been kept a piece of cloth, believed to have belonged to a saint who had been martyred centuries earlier. The monks built their cloisters around it, offering prayers day and night. They swore that the relic protected them and that its power was a blessing. But as centuries passed, the abbey became a place of fear. Chroniclers wrote of monks driven to madness, of shadows that moved without source, and of sounds that rose in the cloisters at midnight. When the monastery was abandoned, the relic disappeared, but the curse remained. Visitors speak of feeling a pull toward the ruins, of hearing faint chanting even when they stand alone, and of seeing shapes move just beyond their vision. The nature of cursed relics is that they are never fully gone. They endure in story, in fear, and in presence. In cloisters where such relics were kept, every stone seems to hum with memory. Pilgrims speak of the sensation of walking into a living memory where the air feels heavier and silence feels charged with something unseen. Some speak of hearing a faint heartbeat echoing through the corridors, a rhythm that quickens with their own breath. Others have felt the weight of a gaze upon them when no one is near, as if the relic itself watches those who step inside. Sacred grounds themselves hold a kind of permanence. An abbey in Wales stands over what was once a place of ancient worship, long before stone cloisters were built there. The monks who lived there built their sanctuaries to honor the holiness of the land. When the monastery fell to ruin, the sanctity of the grounds remained. Visitors to the site speak of an unshakable stillness, of footsteps that follow them across open courtyards, and of a sense of being drawn toward the center of the ruin as if by unseen hands. Some have claimed to see the faint glow of a relic in the darkness, though no such object remains. The ground itself, they say, remember. Cursed relics are often tied to devotion taken to extremes. An abbey in Italy once guarded a jeweled crucifix said to hold the blood of a martyr. The monks swore they would protect it for eternity, sealing their vow in rituals of silence and sacrifice. Over centuries, those rituals became more severe, the chants longer, the fasts harder. Chroniclers wrote of monks who would pray until they bled, offering their devotion as both protection and penance. When the order vanished, the crucifix disappeared. But the abbey became a place of fear and fascination. Travelers speak of shadows gathering near the altar, of whispers that rise in the stillness, and of the scent of iron that clings to the air. The curse of sacred grounds is not always a warning. In some cases, it is a calling. Pilgrims speak of being drawn to such places without knowing why, of finding themselves at the threshold of a cloister and feeling compelled to enter. They speak of dreams that lead them there, of a sense of familiarity and ruins they have never seen. Some claim that the ground itself calls to them, whispering promises they cannot name. The most haunted cloisters are those where relics and sacred grounds meet, where an object of devotion rests on consecrated earth, bound by centuries of prayer and guarded by the memory of sacrifice. And these places are not merely ruins. They are living testaments to faith and fear, to vows kept and vows broken, to the power that objects and places can hold. To walk within such cloisters is to step into something beyond the veil of history. It is to stand in a place where the past is not past, where every stone and shadow holds the memory of devotion and danger, and where the air itself carries a presence that will not fade. Some cloisters hold their relics not as treasures, but as burdens. Their sanctity becomes a chain, binding the faithful and the ground in an unending cycle. Those who have wandered into such places speak of an overwhelming sense that something ancient watches them, of a weight pressing down on the air as if the cloisters themselves breathe in prayer and warning. In these places, the relic is not merely a part of history, it is the heart of a haunting. There is a cloister in Romania where an artifact was kept that is said to have been touched by both saint and sinner. The object itself is lost to time, but the memory endures. Pilgrims who have entered the ruins speak of a sensation of being drawn toward a certain chapel, a pull that grows stronger with every step. They speak of an unseen presence that rises in the silence, of chanting that drifts without source, and of an inexplicable chill that settles over them. Locals avoid the place at night, claiming the air there carries the scent of iron and incense, and that shadows gather where no light falls. The power of cursed relics lies in their permanence. They do not fade with time because they are more than objects. They are vessels of memory and meaning. A relic is shaped by every prayer said beside it, every vow sworn in its presence, every act of devotion offered in its name. When those who guard it vanish, The relic becomes a vessel for something more than faith. It becomes a memory made flesh, a presence that endures. In a ruined monastery in Scotland, the ground itself is said to hold the memory of such a presence. The cloisters stand empty, but travelers speak of hearing soft footsteps echo through the halls, of voices whispering prayer in a tongue they cannot name. Some have felt the weight of unseen hands upon their shoulders. Others have described dreams in which they are kneeling before an altar, holding a relic that does not exist, hearing chanting that fades only at the edge of waking. These experiences speak to something more than superstition. They speak to a presence that lingers in the very bones of the cloister. Sacred grounds are not always places of peace. They can hold the memory of violence as well as devotion. An abbey in Eastern Europe was built upon the site of a great battle, consecrated in blood as much as in prayer. The monks who lived there swore to protect the sanctity of the site, offering centuries of devotion. But the memory of that violence remained. Visitors speak of cold drafts that carry the scent of iron, of shadows that seem to move with purpose, and of whispers that rise without warning. Some have claimed to see figures in habit, kneeling in prayer, though the cloisters stand empty. Cursed relics and sacred grounds are bound by a singular truth. They are places where the veil between devotion and danger grows thin. They are places where faith is anchored to something tangible, and where that tangibility carries a price. The curse is not always vengeance. Sometimes it is a warning. Sometimes it is a calling. Sometimes it is the presence of something that cannot be forgotten. There are cloisters where pilgrims feel compelled to enter not by force, but by a pull they cannot name. They speak of a quiet calling, a sense that the cloister holds something they must see. And in that calling lies both reverence and dread. For to step into such a place is to stand within a living memory, where relic and ground speak of sacrifice, faith, and something older than prayer. The greatest curses are not cast in anger. They are born of devotion. They are born of vows that cannot be broken. And they endure in the silence of cloisters, where every stone, every shadow, and every breath is bound to something that will not rest. To stand within such a cloister is to stand in the presence of a truth that cannot be denied. It is to feel the weight of centuries, to hear the whispers of devotion and warning, and to know that some relics and grounds are not meant to be left behind. In the stillness of those sacred ruins, the past is not gone. It waits, it watches, and it speaks. There are cloisters where silence itself feels like prayer, where the stone walls hum softly with the weight of centuries. In such places, the memory of devotion becomes something living, something that lingers beyond the passing of time. These are the cloisters where the vigil has never ended, where the faithful still kneel in shadow, and the lament still rises in the silence. The vigil is a living thing. It is not bound to flesh alone, but to stone and air. In cloisters where generations of monks and nuns once walked, the prayers they offered became woven into the very fabric of the place. When the orders vanished, the vigils did not end. They became something more enduring, an echo, a presence, a lament that rises when the world outside has gone to sleep. One such place stands in the mountains of Italy, an abbey whose cloisters are built into sheer rock. For centuries, the monks who lived there took a vow to keep vigil over a relic, said to be the heart of their order. They would pray without ceasing, their voices rising in the night like a tide of devotion. When the order disappeared, the abbey fell to ruin, but the vigil did not end. Pilgrims who come there speak of hearing faint chanting in the darkness, of a slow rhythm like a heartbeat that does not belong to any living thing. They speak of shadows moving where no shadow should be, of a silence so complete that it hums with presence. Eternal vigils are not always quiet, Some are filled with lament. Cloisters have been the witnesses to centuries of grief for vows broken, for lives lost, for devotion turned to despair. In such places, the lament becomes part of the stone, a mournful song that rises with the wind. There is a monastery in Ireland where it is said the monks prayed ceaselessly for forgiveness. They spoke of a sin so great that it could not be undone, and they bound themselves to a vow of eternal prayer. When the monastery fell into ruin, the lament remained. Visitors speak of hearing it rise at night, a low, sorrowful chorus that drifts through the cloisters, carrying with it a sadness older than memory. Some cloisters are said to keep their vigils for those who can no longer pray for themselves. A ruined abbey in Eastern Europe is said to stand above a mass grave of the faithful, monks and pilgrims, who perished in a siege centuries ago. The cloisters still stand, and pilgrims speak of hearing soft chanting rise from within the stones. They speak of shadows kneeling in prayer, of whispers carried on the wind, and of a warmth in the air that feels like an embrace and a warning all at once. To enter such a cloister is to step into a living lament, a place where devotion and grief have become inseparable. The vigils of cloisters are not bound to a single order or a single time. They are carried forward by the stones, the air, and the memory of those who walked there. Pilgrims speak of entering ruins and feeling the weight of centuries press upon them. They speak of silence that hums, of chanting that rises without source, and of the sense that they are not alone. Some have awakened from sleep within these cloisters to find themselves kneeling, their palms pressed to cold stone, with no memory of how they came to be there. There is something about cloisters that binds the living and the dead in a vigil that cannot be broken. The vows once spoken there do not end when flesh falls away. They linger in the air, in the stone, in the shadows. They become a presence that does not rest. Pilgrims who have entered such cloisters speak of a pull, a call to stand still and listen. And in the silence, they hear the echoes of prayer and lament, rising as though the cloisters themselves keep their vigil. In some cloisters, the vigil is endless because the lament never ends. It is carried in whispers through corridors, in the shifting of shadow at the edge of vision, in the cold breath of stone and the deep hours of night. It is a prayer that will not cease, a mourning that will not end. To stand within such a place is to stand in the heart of devotion and sorrow, to stand where time itself has been held still. Oh, these eternal vigils and laments are not relics of the past. They are living things, as real as the stone and air that hold them. They speak to those who enter of faith and loss, of vows kept beyond the grave, and of a devotion that endures even when there is no longer anyone to bear witness. Some cloisters hold their vigils in silence, their prayers woven into the stillness like threads of air. Others hold them in sound, in the faint murmur of chanting that drifts without source, in the slow tolling of bells heard long after the monastery has been abandoned. These sounds are not echoes of the past. They are living expressions of the vows that were once spoken within the walls. They persist, carried in stone and shadow, calling the faithful and the curious alike. There is a monastery in the Scottish Highlands whose cloisters are carved deep into the rock of a mountain. For centuries, the monks who lived there took an unending vow to pray for the souls of the departed. The vigil was their life. When the monastery fell to ruin, the vow did not die. Those who have ventured into the cloisters speak of hearing a chant that rises with the wind, of the faint scent of incense and myrrh lingering in the air, and of shadows that kneel though no one stands beside them. Some speak of a pull deeper into the cloisters, as though the stones themselves draw them toward the altar, toward something unseen. Eternal laments often grow from sorrow too deep to be forgotten. Cloisters have been witness to centuries of grief, of vows broken, and prayers unanswered. There's a ruined abbey in Ireland that was once home to a sisterhood devoted to prayer and penance. They swore to keep vigil over the site of a great tragedy, offering their lives in mourning. The abbey fell, but the lament did not die. Visitors speak of hearing a song of mourning rise from the cloisters at night, a chorus of voices speaking in tongues long forgotten. Others have felt tears upon their cheeks, though no rain falls and no one stands near. Some cloisters are said to keep their vigils for those who cannot pray for themselves. A monastery in Eastern Europe stands above what is said to be a mass grave of pilgrims and monks who perished in a siege. The cloisters there stand in silence, but that silence is not empty. Pilgrims speak of hearing chanting rise without cause, of a presence that draws them deeper into the stone halls, and of a warmth that feels like an embrace and a warning all at once. To enter such a cloister is to step into a living lament, where the past and the present are bound together in prayer. The vigil is not bound to the living alone. In these places, the dead keep vigil as well. Pilgrims speak of shadows kneeling in prayer, of murmured chants that fade into silence, and of the sense that they are being watched by something unseen. Some speak of waking within the cloisters to find themselves on their knees, palms pressed to stone, with no memory of how they arrived there. It is as though the vigil draws them in, demanding witness to something older than themselves. The weight of these eternal vigils is not easily borne. Cloisters that have kept such vigils for centuries seem to hold something sacred and terrible in equal measure. The air itself feels charged with purpose, as if every stone remembers the prayers and the grief that has passed over it. Visitors to these places speak of a hush that falls without warning, of a stillness that is heavier than silence, and of the feeling that the walls themselves are holding their breath. There are cloisters where the vigil is unbroken, where the lament never ceases. They stand as living testaments to the devotion of those who once walked their halls. They are places where faith and grief become inseparable, where silence speaks louder than words, and where the air carries something more than prayer. To stand within such cloisters is to stand within something eternal, a vigil that endures beyond the years, a lament that carries beyond the grave. It is to step into a place where the past is not gone, where the vow has never ended, and where the prayer still rises in the shadow of stone. There are cloisters where the vigil is written into the very stones, where every step echoes with centuries of prayer and lament. Pilgrims who have entered such places speak of a stillness so deep that it feels alive, a silence that hums with devotion. These cloisters do not simply witness prayer, they hold it, preserving it beyond the passage of time. One abbey in northern France stands as a testament to this truth. The cloisters there are built around a chapel said to have housed a relic of great sanctity. The monks who lived there took a vow to keep vigil over it forever, offering prayers without end. When the order vanished, the cloister did not fall silent. Pilgrims speak of hearing faint chanting in the corridors long after sunset, of feeling an unseen presence at their side, and of hearing the slow toll of a bell that has no source. To stand there is to feel the weight of devotion that has endured beyond the lives of those who swore it. Eternal laments are not always quiet or subtle. In some cloisters they rise as mournful songs carried on the wind, voices of the faithful joined in sorrow. There is a ruined monastery in Ireland where it is said the monks prayed ceaselessly for the souls of those lost to famine and plague. They swore to keep vigil over the cloisters until the end of days. When the monastery was abandoned, the lament did not end. Travelers speak of hearing a low chorus of voices rising in the cloisters at night, a sound that is neither living nor dead. Others speak of a sadness that settles over them the moment they step through the stone arches, as if the cloister itself mourns. Some cloisters are said to keep their vigils not for the living, but for the dead. In Eastern Europe, there is a monastery built over a forgotten battlefield. The monks who lived there took a vow to pray without end for the fallen. When the monastery fell to ruin, the vow endured. Pilgrims speak of entering the cloisters and feeling the weight of countless prayers pressing down on them. They speak of shadows kneeling silently, of murmured chants that rise in the darkness, and of a warmth that feels both comforting and mournful. These cloisters are not empty. They are filled with a presence that continues to watch, pray, and lament. The vigil in these places is not bound by time. It is a constant, unending act. Cloisters that have kept vigil for centuries do not merely preserve prayer. They make prayer eternal. Pilgrims speak of entering such cloisters and feeling themselves drawn into something greater than history. They speak of hearing voices that call them to kneel, of footsteps that echo without source, and of a presence that holds them still. Some have awakened in such cloisters to find themselves in prayer, their voices joining the silent chorus that has never ceased. There are cloisters where the lament is a living song, rising and falling with the hours of the day. In some places, the lament is said to be the voice of the cloister itself, mourning for vows broken, for prayers unanswered, and for devotion that has been lost to time. Pilgrims speak of hearing the lament grow louder at night, of feeling it resonate in their bones. They speak of entering the cloisters and sensing the weight of centuries pressing upon them, a presence that will not rest until it has been heard. The eternal vigil is not a burden, but a testament. It is the lasting voice of faith, the shadow of vows taken, and the memory of devotion that cannot die. Cloisters that keep such vigils stand as monuments to something beyond flesh and time. They are places where prayer becomes stone, where lament becomes air, and where silence itself is a voice. To stand within such a cloister is to stand within an eternal act of devotion. It is to step into a place where prayer has no end, where lament becomes a prayer, and where the stones themselves keep vigil. Some cloisters are spoken of not only for their stones, but for the living vigil that remains within them. Pilgrims who enter speak of an invisible congregation, shadows kneeling in silent prayer, voices carried on the wind in languages unknown, and the scent of incense that clings to the air even when no flame burns. These are places where the vigil has become more than duty. It has become a presence, a watch that does not end. In a monastery in Spain, cloisters stand over a chamber said to have held a relic of great power. The monks who guarded it swore to keep vigil for as long as stone could hold their prayer. Generations came and went, but the vow was never broken. When the monastery fell to ruin, the cloisters remained alive with devotion. Visitors speak of hearing faint hymns rising through the arches at night, of footsteps echoing softly when no one is near, and of a warmth that seems to gather in the stillness. For those who enter, the vigil is not something they witness, but something they feel a presence older than the walls themselves. Eternal laments are the shadow of that vigil. They are the voice of the cloister's sorrow, carried in a quiet song that rises without source. An abbey in Ireland stands as such a place, where monks once prayed ceaselessly for the souls of those lost to famine and war. When the abbey fell to ruin, the lament did not end. Visitors there speak of hearing a chorus of voices at twilight, soft and mournful, as if the cloister itself weeps. Others speak of waking within the ruins to find themselves in prayer, unaware of how they came to kneel. In these places, the lament is not a sound alone. It is a living memory, bound to stone and air. Some cloisters keep their vigils for the sake of those who cannot speak their own prayers. In the east of Europe, a monastery was built over a battlefield where countless souls were lost. The monks who lived there took a vow to pray without end for the fallen. When the monastery was abandoned, the vow endured. Pilgrims speak of entering its cloisters and feeling the weight of countless prayers pressing on them. They speak of shadows kneeling silently in the corridors, of murmured chants rising in the stillness, and of a warmth that carries both comfort and warning. The vigil in such places is not silent. It speaks in breath and shadow, in prayer and lament, in something that exists beyond human measure. The vigil of these cloisters is timeless. It does not fade with the seasons or crumble with the stones. It is an unbroken act that survives the passage of centuries. To stand within such a place is to stand within a living memory, to be drawn into something far older than yourself. Pilgrims speak of being unable to leave, of a pull deeper into the cloisters, of an unshakable sense that the vigil calls them to witness. Some have left speaking of dreams in which they kneel in candlelight before an unseen altar, hearing voices that fade only when dawn breaks. There are cloisters where the lament rises and falls like the tide, where the prayer itself becomes woven into the fabric of the night. In these places, the lament is not a cry of despair, but a testament, a song of remembrance and devotion that refuses to end. Pilgrims speak of stepping into such cloisters and feeling the air shift, of hearing that lament growing louder with the hours, of feeling the stone hum with something unnameable. They speak of being touched by a presence that is both blessing and warning, of hearing the voices of the faithful long departed. To stand within such cloisters is to stand within eternity. It is to stand where stone and shadow have become prayer, where grief has become devotion, and where silence is not absence, but presence. These cloisters are not merely ruins. They are living monuments to faith. They are places where prayer does not end, where lament becomes eternal, and where the vigil continues beyond the grave. And so the cloisters stand, keeping their watch, silent yet speaking, still yet alive, offering devotion and mourning to all who step within. A vigil without end, a lament without closure, the eternal heart of a faith that will not rest.